Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through our YouTube station, and a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. I look forward to hearing from Jessica Ziparo on her new book, This Grand Experiment, When Women Entered the Federal Workforce in the Civil War Era, Washington, D.C. Before we hear from Jessica, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up this week. Tomorrow at noon, author Richard Silla will discuss his new book with co-author David J. Cohen, Alexander Hamilton on Finance, Credit, and Debt. The authors demonstrate the impact of Hamilton on the modern economic system and guide readers through Hamilton's distinguished career. Then on Thursday at noon, we'll show two short films from our motion picture holdings, A Day in Vietnam and Vietnam Crucible. This screening is part of a series called From the Vaults, Remembering Vietnam, which presents archival films chosen to complement our special exhibit upstairs in the O'Brien Gallery on the Vietnam War. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events at archives.gov. There's a sign-up sheet outside the theater where you can get email updates also. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. Every March, during Women's History Month, we celebrate the contributions and achievements of women in history and today. Often we focus on famous figures of our past, but if we look more closely, we'll see that ordinary women in all facets of society made changes on fundamental levels. Today's speaker, Jessica Ziparo, combed through the records here at the National Archives and other research institutions to uncover the stories of women who seized the chance for challenging work outside the home during the Civil War. Thousands of women came to the nation's capital to obtain federal employment. Those who won positions found rewarding work but also faced prejudice, discrimination, and resentment. They became, nevertheless, pioneers for women in the federal workforce. Since then, women have entered the federal service in increasingly greater numbers. Across all executive agencies today, women make up 43% of the workforce. Here at the National Archives, we do better than that. Women constitute 52% of our total staff. And throughout our agency's history, women have played key roles. The women and men of the National Archives are proud to be entrusted with our nation's documentary heritage, and we're especially pleased to see stories held within the records coming to light in books such as This Grand Experiment. Jessica Ziparo earned her bachelor's degree from James Madison University, where she majored in history. After earning her JD at Harvard Law School, she worked as an environmental attorney lawyer at Latham and Watkins in San Diego. She also taught environmental law as an adjunct professor at the University of San Diego School of Law. And it was this experience that inspired her to get back in the classroom and return to her love of history. While she earned her master's and PhD from Johns Hopkins, she and Louis Galambos wrote an annotated bibliography of selected publications, 1991 to 2010, on Dwight David Eisenhower. And Galambos actually is going to be here on April 3rd with his new book on Dwight Eisenhower. In addition to this grand experiment, for which she was named as one of the 35 best debut authors over 35 for 2017, she is a contributing editor to Counterpoints, Women and the Civil War, forthcoming from Kent State University. Please welcome Jessica Ziparo.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, David Ferriero, for that introduction. Thank you to the National Archives and Doug Swanson for having me, and thank you all, including C-SPAN, for being here to learn about the first women to work for the federal government during the Civil War. So hiring women was not a conscious decision made by a monolithic federal government. Congress never passed a law saying supervisors must hire women, but it also never passed a law saying that they couldn't. So that's why I've termed it a messy organic affair. Different supervisors along different departments brought women into their workforce for different reasons. It depended on their budget constraints, on their workloads, and on their individual feelings of what women should and could be doing. There's a myth that the government hired women during the Civil War era because all the men were off fighting, and that's an understandable misunderstanding. The government hired women not because it lacked male applicants, because it never lacked male applicants. The problem was that it lacked qualified men who were willing to work for the government at the rates the government could pay. So in women, the government found qualified employees who were able to do all of the job for half or less than the pay. So it's not that men were off fighting, it was that they wanted more money. The government was hemorrhaging workers to the private sector, male workers. And in women, they found this huge number of qualified employees. This is the title page from a book called Employments of Women by Virginia Penny. So it was ironic that the government hired women because they could pay them so little, because the women wanted these jobs in the government because they paid so much more than women could earn in other lines of work. So in 1863, Virginia Penny published this book. You can actually find it on Google Books if you're interested to look through it. It's a pretty interesting read. And she found 392 different jobs women could be doing, because suddenly now women were dependent on their own exertions. But that number is really inflated, because when you dig into her data and her suggestions, they're not so great. So one, for example, was women could paint artificial eyes. Well, that's not going to employ very many women. Others were really unrealistic. So it was women could grow their hair and sell it. That's not really going to support a family. Others were theoretical. I've heard a woman was a lawyer in Italy in 1592. So maybe women could do that, but it's probably not a good idea. And then others would damn someone to hell because she said, well, you could be a fortune teller, but that would mean you'd have to sell your soul to Satan, so you probably don't want to do that either. So despite Penny's 392 options for women working in the 1860s, really the main things that women had available to them were they could be domestic workers. That was the vast majority of women working in non-agricultural jobs. Or they could work in factories making textiles. And then to a lesser extent, teaching, writing, printing work. But none of those paid as much as the government was willing to pay. Women from all over the country besieged the government for these jobs. Newspapers would describe the number of female applicants as without number, innumerable, overwhelming. The Department of Agriculture ultimately cut off employing a lot of women because the commissioner couldn't handle the pressure and number of female applicants all the time. So who were these women? I've identified through the Federal Register, employee records, newspapers, census data, divorce cases, diaries, over 3,100 women who worked for or applied to the federal government during the period I examined, which was 1859 to 1871. Most of the women in my book are white and middle class, and that's for two reasons. One, most of the clerks, women working as clerks, likely were white and middle class because you needed the influence and the money to be able to travel to DC to obtain these jobs. And also, those are the women most likely to leave behind records that I could later find and look at. But especially during this early period, during the 1860s, it was more complicated than that. So I found 21 African-American women who were working as laborers or clerks during this period. I found 2 women who were deaf, one of whom was a Polish orphan. I found women escaping abusive marriages into the federal government that allowed them to get away from their husbands who were threatening to murder them. I found young and old, rich and poor, and from around the world. Women from Africa were working for the federal government. Women from all over the world were coming to the federal government to work for them. So, huge numbers of women applying for these jobs. How did the government choose among them? Of the 273 employee files I reviewed from the War and the Treasury Department, 235 contained materials for new hire. So the other ones would have contained, for example, reapplication materials. But 235 contain brand new applications. Of these, only 45 were successful, or 1 in 5. And I actually think that number is inflated, because until sometime in the 1860s, the government would return your letters of recommendation if you were tired of waiting to hear whether or not you got the job and you needed to find a job somewhere else. It was really hard to get influence, as we'll talk about. So if you had that letter and you weren't getting a job with the federal government, you'd call it back and use it in another place. So I actually think that number, 1 in 5, is actually high. So how did supervisors choose among these women to choose that 1 in 5? So women quickly learned that to be successful and to obtain this job, she needed 2 things: influential friends, and a good story. This is Jane Swisshelm. She worked for the War Department. She was also a newspaper editor, and she said, to get an appointment, no qualifications are required except influential friends. Her influential friend was Stanton, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who got her a job. Influential friends were the most important part of any applicant's quest for federal employment, male or female. Most successful applications enjoyed the support of at least one congressman or senator, and some had dozens of signatures of congressmen, senators, generals, state politicians. But getting influence was hard, especially for women. So at this point in time, women were denied the vote. They were typically relegated to the domestic sphere, so they didn't have a lot of chances to form connections that would create powerful, influential, supporting recommendations. And women struggled with the act of trying to obtain recommendations. Some expressed anxiety at the idea of trying to obtain influence. In 1865, Maria Baker wrote her letter of application to the War Department explaining she didn't have recommendations, and she explained, "I feel too delicate to ask for letters of recommendation, as this is quite a new position for me to be placed in." She didn't get the job. This is Mary Clemmer Ames. She wrote a guidebook to DC that came out in 1873. She said that if a woman wanted a job in Washington, the first thing she had to do was go and tell her story to a man. And the story was just as important as the man. So if a man was sufficiently interested in her story, she obtained the coveted place, no matter what her qualifications for it or lack of them might be. Another guidebook author in 1873 wrote, "It may be stated as a fact that whereas a man by his vote or his electioneering services may secure employment under government, a woman must attain it through her dire necessities and bereavements." What most moved supervisors and recommenders was a tale of poverty and suffering that evoked a paternalistic pity. White middle-class women in these letters were being described as in destitute poverty, very poor, indigent, in extreme need. So again, this entire process was heavy with paternalism. Application files contain latent and explicit requests for the government to step into the shoes of an absent male breadwinner, typically father or husband, and support a needy woman. This 1873 guidebook contained an 8-stanza poem about a Civil War widow who found a job in the Treasury and was thus able to move forward with her life because, quote, "the strong, benignant government she feels about her like a lover." But what if you strayed from that narrative? This is Dr. Mary Walker. She was the first and only woman to receive the Medal of Honor. She served as the acting assistant surgeon. She spied for the Union, for which she was captured by Confederates and imprisoned in Richmond for a while. And in 1865, Johnson awarded her the Medal of Honor for Meritorious Service, the only woman to have received that medal. Side note, it was actually rescinded in 1917 when they changed the qualifications for the Medal of Honor that you had to see actual combat. But then it was posthumously given back to her in 1977. But she wore it all the time, so she has it on there. She always wore it. She was trying to get, by 1869, she was trying to get an Army commission, and she was unable. So she turned to the federal departments. She tried to obtain a clerical job with the federal department, believing that her war record and qualifications should secure her a position. Espousing these beliefs rather than sticking to that narrative of neediness and paternalism, it earned her no job and public ridicule. So newspapers in at least 9 states in the District of Columbia mocked her for her attempts to get a job with the federal government. On May 11th, the Baltimore Sun described the encounter purported to have occurred between her and Postmaster John Cresswell, in which Walker demanded a position, citing her loyalty, her Army record, in support of this claim. And she left unsuccessful. And then the story kept getting more hyperbolic as time went on. So by the end of the month, the Boston Daily Journal was informing her readers that Walker was demanding the appointment of Secretary of Legation to Spain, and when asked if she could speak the language, the valuable dame replied that the appointment was not a question of languages, but the recognitions of the rights of women. And these articles served as a reminder to people out there, if you want a job with the federal government, this is not how you go about it. Although this is a public failure of a public person, having gone through all of those employee files, I can tell you that women that applied based only on their skills were unsuccessful in getting their jobs. And it's really sad to see, because you'll see some women who are going over and over, here are my qualifications, I don't understand why I'm not getting this job, and her supervisor, her recommender is saying, writing letters to her supervisor saying, I've seen the women that work there, she would be really good at this job, and she gave up after a while because she never got the job. So women learned that they needed to frame themselves as helpless and dependent and needy, even though their actions in trying to get a job revealed that helplessness to be a fiction. So what did women do for the federal government during this period? Just like it would be really hard for me to stand up here in a talk and tell you exactly what all men did for the federal government during this period, it's hard for me to tell you what women did, but I'll give you some examples. This is the government hospital for the insane. It was also known as St. Elizabeth's because soldiers were there during the Civil War and didn't really love the return address of government hospital for the insane when they were writing home. So that's the exterior, and down there is the floor plan of the second floor of the women's building from 1853. So in the government hospital for the insane, women worked as attendants. Men worked as attendants too for the male patients. These jobs were pretty hard. You slept with the patients, you had a lattice wall separating you, you ate with the patients, you were constantly with the patients. So in addition to attendants, though, women worked as dairymaids, laundresses, cooks, chambermaids. Similarly, in the Senate and the House and other federal departments, women scrubbed the floors and polished brass and washed the drapery. So they did these kinds of manual work. Women did other kinds of manual labor too. So this is, over here, this is the Treasury Department. So men and women worked on the same machines printing money. And down here is the government printing office. And here women are working as stitchers, so they're stitching pages into books. In clerical positions, though, many of the tasks that the government hired women to do had been carved out from men's jobs. So federal work at this time was not very well structured. So in one, a man could come in and copy a letter for 2 hours and then write a letter himself and then tabulate accounts. So when women started coming in, some supervisors carved off those jobs that didn't require a lot of training and gave them to women. And copying was the most common example. So women would copy, letters into ledgers or any kind of copying work. Or they would be charged with comparing the copy work of others. Did you copy it correctly? So that was a very common job for women. But some tasks that were carved off and given to women, women developed this prized expertise that was really respected inside and outside of the government. And these women are an example of that kind of job. So these women are counting worn notes and at the same time looking for counterfeits. So women became prized counters. And William P. Fessenden, who had been Secretary of the Treasury, recommended that these counters should be compensated equally to male clerks, as their work was as laborious and required, quote, a good deal of care and a great deal of skill also. And it really did, because if a woman passed a counterfeit note, or if she miscounted, she was personally liable for the money that was lost. No man in the federal government had this giant liability assigned to his job, and women actually formed this sort of informal employee insurance, where if she, for example, accidentally passed a note, it would wipe out her monthly salary, if not more. And so they'd all come together and pitch in a little bit to cover the female coworker, so that if the next time she miscounted, she'd be similarly covered and not wiped out. And these women were dispatched across the country to count money, because they were the experts at counting money. Redeeming currency was another expert position that women worked in. So if money was burned, or it sank in a boat, or rats found your hidden stash and made a nest of it, and then you went to pay your bills and suddenly it was a rat nest, you would send it to DC to the women who redeemed currency, and they would figure out exactly how much was there. This is the dead letter office. This is actually a picture from the late 19th, early 20th century, but I have an etching from 1870 that shows it was the same setup. So women and men worked together in the dead letter office. The women were stuck up here, which they complained about quite a lot because it was very hot and it didn't smell very good. And the men were down here. But they're doing the same job. So when a piece of postage, which could be a letter or it could be an item, didn't have sufficient, a good address on it, so it would just say, to John in America, these men and women were charged with trying to get it to John in America, to do the detective work to figure out who John was and where he lived. So men and women were doing the same job. At this point, women were getting paid half or less than the men for doing the same job. The only thing women couldn't do at this time period in the dead letter office was open the mail, because it might contain something scandalous. So the women weren't allowed to open the mail initially, but they could do all the detective work of trying to redirect it. So despite the weak and needy narrative I talked about before, some women needed to bring really specialized skills to do jobs with the federal government. This is the post office, and in 1870, 2 women translated the entire foreign correspondence and kept up accounts in various languages. In the Treasury Department, the women of the 5th Auditor's Office, who worked on State Department accounts, had to possess a knowledge of banking and mathematics to do their jobs. In the Internal Revenue Bureau, they had to know a variety of internal tax codes and regulations. In the Department of Agriculture, Lois Bryant Adams had been an editor of a Michigan agricultural periodical, and she was a woman of much intelligence who made a study of botany and natural history. And in the Patent Office, both men and women worked as copyists of drawings, so a woman had to be an artist and a draftswoman to be able to do that kind of work. Female federal employees in this early initial wave earned women a place and a foothold not only in federal employment, but also in the nation's capital. Female federal employees joined in social, philanthropic, and intellectual activities with their male coworkers and boarding house mates. DC was a tough place for anyone to live during the Civil War. It was especially difficult for women. It was difficult for single women in any city to live because when they went to find a place to live, they were automatically assumed to be prostitutes. So it was really hard for women to get in there and find a place to live and navigate this difficult city. But women did, and as the number of female federal employees grew, shops and stores and boarding houses started catering to them. So here you have a boarding announcement for ladies only, and they're specifically looking for ladies of the departments. Here, there was an extra compensation that came through, a slight bump in salary, and they said, invest your extra pay in a sewing machine. This is hard to read, but this is like a trinket shop, and it was near the Treasury, so they're specifically calling on the ladies employed in the Treasury Department to come shop at their store. Women were constantly in fear of losing their job. And so this was, at one point, 53 women had been laid off from the government printing office, and this school puts out an ad, oh, what are you gonna do? Maybe come learn business at our school, and you'll be more employable. So women become this recognizable market in DC because of female federal employees. Although women made much less money than their male counterparts, and I'm gonna talk about that in more detail, it was still more than women made in other lines of work. And so that extra money and the time that they saved, because many of them were living in boarding houses, so they didn't have domestic duties, meant that they could engage in political and philanthropic activities if they so choose. Julia Wilbur was one who very much so chose. So in April 1869, which was before Wilbur worked for the Patent Office, she was one of 7 women who attempted to register to vote in DC. And then she decided she wanted a job at the Patent Office, and she went to the mayor to get a recommendation, and he said, I heard what you did, and I don't think you're ever gonna get a job in the federal government because you went to try to register to vote. She actually did. It was very hard, but she managed to get a job at the Patent Office. But 2 years later, when women went to register to vote, she didn't go. And I think, it doesn't say why in her diary, she notes that they did, but she didn't go with them. And I think partially, the federal government discouraged women from engaging in suffrage work. So I think that was part of the reason why Wilbur was reticent to go. There's evidence that female federal employees were discouraged from participating in suffrage. So for example, during suffrage meetings, male clerks would sometimes come in and disrupt the meeting and make a scene. And if you're working alongside those male clerks and they recognize you and you're holding on to your job barely, you don't want to do that. You don't want to risk your very coveted, very hard to get, very easy to lose job. As we'll see, this lack of cooperation among the suffrage movement and women seeking equal pay later in the decade had ramifications for both causes, I think. So women's initial entrance into the federal workforce was not a topic that generated a lot of newspaper articles. Usually, if newspapers were talking about this, it was with a neutral or approving tone. So for example, a Boston newspaper reporting on women clipping Treasury notes said, oh, how nice that the tender sex should prepare the legal tender. So it didn't really seem to upset people initially. Although newspapers were silent on the subject, it was probably setting some tongues wagging in DC. Suddenly you have hundreds of single women traversing the streets. By 1863, definitely hundreds of women traversing the streets to their jobs in publicly accessible buildings. And one woman experienced the danger of this being publicly accessible very personally. And I should warn you, there's a sexually explicit, crude slide coming up. It's the only one in the presentation, but just if you're uncomfortable, avert your eyes for a minute or two. So In April 1863, Reverend Richmond, who was a Union Army chaplain and a Harvard grad, he had a messenger in the Treasury deliver one of his letters to Rose Belaski, who was a young woman who worked in the Internal Revenue Bureau. His dense, scratchy, sexually explicit text surround multiple pictures he had drawn of his penis. Richmond sustained an aggressive harassment of Belaski, and there were multiple letters. He would send her multiple letters. He would sit at the messenger desk, write out these horrible letters, and send them up. She wasn't responding to them, and he started to become really frantic and threatened to send them to her mom. And she wasn't responding. Eventually, it came to the attention of her supervisor and then the War Department. So the War Department dispatched a guy, and he said he caught him doing it. But he said there is no law that prevents him from harassing her. There was no law to protect women like Rose. Ultimately, they kicked him out of the city because they declared him insane. But Rose must have been traumatized by being the source of a federal investigation and this sustained sexual harassment. Okay, and then the scandal happened. So this is the Treasury Department scandal of 1864, my very quick overview. So Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase up here, and the Republicans in Congress instituted a new uniform currency called the greenback, which is down here. Beginning in the fall of 1862, this guy, Spencer Clark, he was in charge of the entire process of creating greenbacks, so like the physical greenback. And he hired men and women to do this, and he hired Dr. Stuart Gwynn to create a counterfeit-proof paper that would allow, that would discourage counterfeiters from trying to make fake greenbacks. So with a new currency of questionable constitutionality printed in large denominations on experimental paper in a newly created bureau by women, their rumors start flying around. People are not happy about this, charging fraud, theft, and immorality. Chase and the Republican-dominated Congress couldn't have this negative rumor going around because the greenback wasn't tied to species. So it wasn't tied to silver or gold. It was based solely on the integrity of the nation. So if you didn't believe in the Treasury Department and what was going on there, the greenbacks weren't going to be worth very much. Chase also was eyeing that Republican nomination in 1864. So he wanted his reputation squeaky clean when he went in. So he hires this guy, Baker. So Baker, he says, go in, tell me everything's great in the Treasury. That's not what Baker does. Baker goes in, he immediately arrests a guy for embezzling, and then he arrests Stuart Gwynn, the guy who's making the counterfeit paper. Gwynn doesn't enjoy being arrested, and he turns around and sues Baker in 3 lawsuits. Baker turns back to the Treasury and says, you better come to my defense in these lawsuits, or I'm going to reveal all of these terrible things I learned when I was investigating the Treasury. And the solicitor of the Treasury, Edwin Jordan, says, okay, fine, calls his bluff. So Baker breaks into her house, her boarding house room, sorry. So breaks into her room, her name is Ella Jackson, breaks into her room, goes through her diaries, her letters, and she returns home. She worked in the printing bureau with Clark. She returns home, and he says, your roommate, Jenny Gurman, who's actually not pictured here, but your roommate, Jenny Gurman, told me all the things you were doing in the Treasury Department, and I know you were having affairs with Clark and all these other men, so you better confess. And she confessed. Then Jenny Gurman comes home, and he says, Ella Jackson confessed you were doing all of these terrible things in the Treasury Department, so you better confess. She confesses. And then he also gets the testimony of Laura Duvall, who's up here. So Jenny Gurman would say things like, Clark told her his wife believed that the Treasury Department was nothing more nor less than a house of ill fame, and that he had paid her $40 independent of her wages once. This comes to the attention of James Brooks of New York, a Democrat, and he launches a congressional inquiry into all of this. In the spring of 1864, he launches this investigation. On June 30th, 1864, the House Committee presented a 418-page report. It was split along party lines. So it was a 5-4 decision. Garfield wrote the majority opinion. Garfield and the majority Republicans said that all of these rumors were just a conspiracy by Baker and the female prostitutes associated with him. James Brooks disagreed, and he said that the Treasury had been converted into a place of debauchery and drinking, the very recital of which is impossible without violating decency. So what did this mean for my female federal employees? This is a political cartoon from 1864. It was a Democrat cartoon that was focused at the Republicans. This is Lincoln in blackface. It's hard to see. And then over here is the Treasury Department, and they're under a sign that says, Treasury Department, a new way to pay old debts. So the implication being that these women were serving as prostitutes. It also sparked a national conversation. So in New York and New Hampshire, newspapers declared that a regular system of prostitution is carried on in the female bureau of the Treasury. In Chicago, the Times is portraying the Treasury Department as a seraglio ablaze with jewels and musical with wanton laughter, and claimed other offices employing women were similarly debauched. And just a reminder, this whole period, the employment of women is considered an experiment. So this is really damaging. In Massachusetts, they're describing female clerks as vile women and known to be such, who have been links in a chain of vice and corruption, reaching up and down and polluting even the chambers of the Capitol. In Ohio, they're characterizing women in the Treasury as women of easy virtue and claiming the department has a few rooms fitted up in the Oriental style of splendor, and that a regular harem is kept for the benefits of persons high in the confidence of the president. And in New Orleans, the newspaper is declaring, whatever may be the result of these investigations, the employment of female clerks will not henceforth be popular here. So this scandal threatened female employment entirely. The women associated with the scandal, the three young women, Duval, Gurman, and Jackson, were immediately fired. Even though the House Committee told the Treasury Department, don't fire them, immediately fired. I just have to tell you what Clark did, though. So Clark, totally unchastened by this whole thing. Clark, in 1866, put his own face on the fractional currency. People didn't like this very much, and this is why we have a rule now that you can't have living people on the currency. So you can have Mr. Clark to thank for that. So negative rumors about female federal employees were problematic because these were the best jobs women could hope to attain in this period, and women were holding on to them very tenuously. My initial version of this slide had, I don't remember, maybe 25 articles that I was just going to click through to give an example, to give a show of how often there were newspaper articles about being laid off, women being laid off, but it kept crashing my presentation, so you get the idea. So constant articles about discharge of female clerks, dismissal of clerks at the Treasury, dismissal of female clerks. Oops. Men and women were being dismissed. For men, there were other lines of work to which they could go. But remember, for women, there was nothing. There was nothing that paid as well as federal employment. So you have, for example, a woman who goes up to her supervisor and says, are you going to keep me on the payrolls? Because if you don't, a man just proposed to me, and I don't like him, but I have to accept if you're going to fire me. So to women, losing their jobs was catastrophic. There was no other thing that they could do that would pay them as much. And a lot of these women were supporting parents, children, siblings. So they had a lot of financial responsibility, and to lose their job would have been really bad for them. So there was a great deal of anxiety among the female federal employees to retain their job, which also explains why they were reticent to participate in the suffrage movement, which was seen as radical. This chaos and instability discouraged solidarity, too, because it was every woman for themselves. So a woman might lose her job, and in her letter to regain her job, she would write, you can get rid of Mary Smith. Her husband didn't do as much as mine did in the war, or her father didn't campaign for you like my father did, and so you can fire her, and I can come back in. So it was very cutthroat and discouraging, obviously, solidarity. But just so you kind of see, these are my numbers. These are from the Federal Register, which is a document that underreported the number of employees, especially female employees. So not on here is the government printing office, and the Treasury is missing hundreds of women that were employed at this time. But you'll see that the numbers pretty consistently go up. There was a slight dip in 1869, but for women in the Treasury, their percentage of how much they comprised of the Treasury Department went up for this whole period. Because again, they were way cheaper. The government could hire a woman to do the same job for half the pay. So as budgets are being constrained, supervisors are turning to women because they can get the job done and not go over their budgets. And I mentioned before the Agricultural Department. See, at 1867, he had 17, and then he was so sick of dealing with female applicants and their recommenders, he just started cutting down on female employees. So this brings us to the argument for equal pay. So women fought and almost achieved equal pay in this period. Here's what's working against them that we've seen today so far. So to obtain their jobs, they had to produce these pathos-laden applications that describe themselves as needy and in need of paternalistic support and protection. The suffrage movement and female federal employees weren't on the same page. They were not a united front. The Treasury Department and subsequent media had created a negative idea about female federal employees, And finally, the turbulent nature of federal employment discouraged group action. So that's all going to work against women as they seek equal pay in this period. So let's talk about how much women were making. When women entered the executive departments, supervisors set their salary. It wasn't until March of 1864, when Congress passed the Deficiency Act, that made the $600, which was half of the lowest paid male clerk, that made that the law. That's what women earned in the federal departments in March 1864. Despite this pay inequality, as we've talked about, though, many working women were excited because this was way more than they could earn in other lines of work. Although still new to their jobs and retaining them somewhat precariously, between late 1864 and early 1870, Congress received 11 separate petitions asking for an increase in women's salaries. These petitions contained at least 740 female federal employee signatures, and some of these women argued that since they perform the same work as men, they should be paid the same. And these petitions I found right here in the National Archives, which was very exciting. So the conventional understanding is that this equal pay movement didn't really gain momentum until World War I. But these petitions and the discussions in Congress show that it actually was far earlier than that. Oh, sorry. Just to explain, the first class, second class, third class, fourth class, this didn't necessarily tie exactly into what men did. It was a combination of sort of what they did and how long they'd been there. It was a little informal, and it depended on supervisors. But frequently in the newspapers and in Congress, they talk about a woman doing a $600 job, which was the first class, second class, or third class equivalent. So women were earning far less. And I'll note that this salary is not only very low, it's flat, which means women had no room for advancement. There was no incentive to work harder. You couldn't earn more than that. You were stuck at 600 until 1865, which we'll talk about. So these are some of the petitions here. This one I just wanted to highlight. This was a petition of women employed as sweepers and scrubbers in the Treasury Department praying for an increase of compensation. A number of these women were African American and a number were illiterate. So it would be their printed name and they would have just X'd their name next to it. So I have very few documents for laborers and African American women, so this was one of my favorite that I found because I could finally find them in the records, which was difficult to do. So although these positions were in high demand and well paid when compared to other female occupations in America, male clerks' efforts to receive higher pay show that women's salaries were too low to maintain a middle-class lifestyle in D.C. So these are petitions of women asking for more pay. There were also tons of petitions from men saying, we need more money. Men were constantly complaining about how little they made in the federal government. You can see this in supervisors' reports to Congress where they say, I can't keep my men because we need more money to pay them. Men would come together and say, maybe let's all live in Baltimore and commute to D.C. because we can't afford to live in D.C. Men would petition the government to create these markets where they could buy food at lower prices or create these camps where they could live so they didn't have to pay the high cost of rent at boarding houses. And remember, they were making way more than women were. So women coming in petitioning for more pay, men were doing it at the same time at their far higher salaries. 42 women in the Treasury Department petitioned Congress in January 1865, quote, for an increase in salary commensurate with the increased price of living in this city. The women argued that, quote, many of us are employed upon work such as commands for gentlemen $1,214 per annum, and they complain of their inability to provide for their families. Again, they were constantly complaining about how little that was. In 1865, Congress raised women's pay to $720 per year, which I'm sure was welcome, but it still wasn't equal pay, and it wasn't what men were claiming women needed to survive a middle-class lifestyle in D.C. during the 1860s. And women continued to agitate. In 1866, this petition, 59 female Treasury Department employees petitioned Congress for a salary increase. They began by expressing their gratitude for their positions with the government, but asked them to consider the, quote, vast disproportion existing between male and female salaries. The petitioners explained, while we do not grudge our male friends one iota of the success which falls to their share, yet when they, by whose side we sit day after day, whose labors and duties are identical with our own, and whose home responsibilities in most instances are not so great, whose salaries commence with $1,200 per annum when they are promoted from first to second and from second to third class clerkships, the question forces itself upon us. What makes us to differ from them? They asked, if women can perform the same clerical duties as men, should not their salaries approximate in some degree to theirs? In the General Appropriation Bill of 1866, Congress partially acknowledged these women. So Congress raised their salaries to $900 per year. Although the additional compensation was welcome, it wasn't equal pay, and this conversation was just beginning. On December 16, 1868, Representative Thomas Jones, a Democrat from Kentucky, by, quote, unanimous consent, submitted to the House the following resolution. Resolved, that all females in the employment of government be allowed equal pay where they perform like service with males. Baltimore's Sun applauded this action, reporting that female employees, quote, have been asking for this all session, but unfortunately they, it seems, could not obtain a champion until this late day. From 1867 to 1870, women and their advocates in Congress fought to have female salaries brought into parity with male salaries. In 1867, 1869, and 1870, the issue was argued in Congress. The prevailing spirit in the debates and in newspapers reporting on it seemed to be for equality. Both houses of Congress passed bills equalizing male and female salaries, but the change didn't come. So the arguments in these four debates were very similar because they kept having the same conversation, so I just kind of analyzed them as one long conversation. There were a lot of men in favor of equal pay. In 1869, Senator Pomeroy asked, where labor is performed, the compensation should be according to the capacity and character of the labor. And if the same labor is performed by one person as by another, and the same amount of time in a day is bestowed on it, why should not the compensation be the same? Radical Republicans, including Pomeroy, led the charge for equal pay, but they weren't alone. Some Democrats, who had also been supporters of slavery, which created a great deal of cognitive dissonance reading because former slavery supporters would say things like, well, if the laborer has one head and two hands, and they do the same labor as another person who has two hands and one head, shouldn't they be paid the same? You're sort of like, well, weren't you arguing something very different 3 or 4 years ago? But they were fighting for equal pay as well. The arguments for equality were straightforward. This is the just thing to do. And they were imbued with the ideological rhetoric of equality that was permeating the nation's capital at this time. The men who advocated for equal pay believed that the government should be a force for social change. In 1867, Senator Richard Yates of Illinois called upon his fellow senators to let an example go out from the American Congress that labor performed by everyone shall have its fair reward and that there shall be perfect equality between all American citizens without reference to color, race, or sex. So we've been fighting for this for a really long time. But not every congressman ascribed to this ideological view, and several had different ideas about what the role of government in American society should be. They viewed government as a business and believed that they had a responsibility to the people of America to guard the coffers. The government could pay women less because female labor was worth less all over the country, and there was a limitless supply of it. Remember, as these arguments are happening, supervisors are overwhelmed by the number of female applicants coming in. So Senator Roscoe Conkling, who's a Republican from New York, argued that the pay question was a straightforward matter of supply and demand. The supply was vast. Women from all over the country were begging for government jobs. Because women were willing to work at $900 per year, Conkling argued, it is not true as a business proposition that more money need to be appropriated in order to command the services. Conkling could not vote that the funds which we administer as trustees here shall be paid in greater sums that are necessary to obtain and abundantly and certainly obtain the services required. Such men believe that the government should not be used to effect social change. This is New Hampshire Republican Senator Aaron Cragen, who believed that it would be, quote, bad policy to pay women more. We all know that there's a distinction between the compensation paid to females and males in the Department of Life. While Cragen was not saying this is right, he just said it's an existing fact, and it wasn't the government's job to upset it. As politicians are having these arguments in Washington, though, women are responding and continuing to agitate for justice. So you have Gertrude, who wrote to the pro-woman suffrage paper, The Revolution, in December 1869. She had been a clerk in the Treasury for 4 years. And she asked, what is our work? Is it brain work? Does work have sex? We do not want to be petted. We want simply justice. We are not playthings. We are not dolls. We are human beings. It's perhaps not surprising, in light of how women's applications were framed, that the argument that appears to have had the most resonance among men who were opposed to equal pay was the one that framed itself as protective of women and paternalistic. So these men argued that if women's salaries were to be raised, they'd all lose their jobs. So we shouldn't raise women's salaries because then they're all going to lose their jobs. They're going to be replaced by men, and we should protect these women. Congressmen argued that department heads wouldn't hire women if they had to pay them the same amount. and that men would crowd them out of the federal departments. So this is Senator William Stewart, a Republican from Nevada. There is not a head of the department nor a head of a bureau who would not rather have a male clerk in the bureau than a female clerk doing precisely the same work. To raise women's salaries, quote, will be to drive the females from the departments and substitute them for male clerks. Curiously, however, none of the men arguing this provided any evidence from the departments that supervisors wouldn't hire women at higher salaries. And the supervisors hadn't been mum on this. Beginning in 1863, supervisors discussed in varying levels of detail their female federal employees in reports to Congress. These reports were never explicitly mentioned in these debates. There was also a circular that had been sent around by a congressional committee to the principal officers of the federal departments in an effort to reform the civil service, and there was a question that explicitly asked about female federal employees. These did not come up in these debates. The Treasury Department records especially reveal that supervisors generally agreed that their female employees were underpaid. But whether their salaries should be raised and by how much was a source of disagreement. Several of them praised the economy of hiring women. And you can imagine, because they're trying to get all this work done on a very constrained budget. And in women, they can do it. So a lot of them are praising, well, it's a really great economical move that we can hire these women at these lower salaries. But that's not the case for everyone. So this is the director of the Bureau of Statistics, Alexander Delmar. So these men were hiring that women were underpaid. So in 1868, for example, he told Congress in his annual report, "There does not appear to me to be any sound reason why, as government clerks, if they prove capable of performing equally arduous and difficult services, they should not be equally remunerated." Overall, however, there's this ambivalence in these reports about female pay. Like many congressmen, you can see these men having this problem squaring the obvious injustice of paying women less with this ingrained sort of subconscious notion that they simply should be paid less. The negative reputation of women, largely gained and publicized by the Treasury scandal, also hamstrung women's efforts and led some to say that we just shouldn't, let's not talk about equal pay, let's just fire all the women. This was an experiment, it failed, let's get rid of them. So this was a newspaper, and this was from the New York Times. It would seem that the employment of women as clerks in the government departments at Washington has proved a failure. So as they're debating this, remember, still an experiment. And you have in these debates Democratic Republican Anthony A.C. Rogers of Arkansas. As they're debating whether or not women should be paid equally, he comes out with, "If I live to be a month older, I'm going to introduce a bill abolishing this business of female employment altogether." He said it was, quote, "degrading to the people of this country that we should have congregated here year after year around this hall and in our lobbies a parcel of women hired, it is pretended, for the purposes of the government, but in many instances, I believe, for other purposes altogether." Overall, however, the tone of the debate in Congress and out of Congress was in favor of equal pay. The House and Senate passed bills making male and female salaries equal, only to see them die in committee. So, for example, in 1868, the House passed a resolution that women and men should be paid equally by a margin of 123 to 27. The Daily Morning Chronicle described this successful, it died in committee so it wasn't successful, but this successful equal pay resolution, quote, "as the child of common sense and justice that, quote, undoubtedly reflects the opinions of the mass of the American people." But pay wasn't equalized. In the So the movement for equal pay enjoyed the support, but like I said, it kept falling out in committee. And the congressmen themselves were really confused about what kept happening. So here you have Senator Trumbull, who thought they equalized pay in 1869 by a very decided vote, but somehow or other, in a committee of conference, the provision was lost, I know not how. In February 1870, Representative Holman claimed that an 1869 bill equalizing pay failed because it was sent to a committee of conference late in the session, quote, "and by one of the most extraordinary instances of legislation, this provision, which had been concurred on by both branches of Congress, was stricken out after a full and free conference." The men advocating for equal pay failed again in 1870, but Congress did pass a resolution that supervisors could now appoint women to those graded classes of clerkships. So whereas before women were stuck in that flat salary thing, in 1870, Senator Trumbull proposed an amendment that would equalize clerical pay, but what they actually passed was, okay, we're not going to pass that, but supervisors, you can appoint women to those first, second, third class, fourth class clerkships if you want. Trumbull said, well, they're just not going to do anything now, and he was right. It's clear from the Federal Register there was a small flurry of promotions, which indicated that some supervisors had been waiting to put women in that graded class of clerkships because they believed that they had earned it and they deserved it, but there wasn't an appreciable flurry of promotions. It wasn't an appreciable number. So much so that Quartermaster Montgomery Meigs felt compelled to write a letter of thanks to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton when he agreed to put Emma Sedgwick on that graded class of clerkships. And Meigs wrote, "It is an acknowledgement of, an incentive to, faithful service, and is executing a law of Congress which has not, I fear, been as generally useful as was intended by Congress itself, because it has not yet been sufficiently acted on." And it wouldn't be sufficiently acted on for many, many years. With tight budgets, no congressional mandate, and an endless supply of female applicants, department heads were agonizingly slow in promoting women. In 1881, 79% of female clerks still earned $900 per year or less. In 1901, more than 30 years after Republican Florida Senator Welch declared that it was a, quote, ignoble prejudice to make any distinction in the payment of labor simply because the laborer is a female, 43% of women in the Treasury Department still only earned $900 per year or less. So this legislative failure, despite strong support for equal pay, makes the absence of the suffrage movement even more significant, because these women in the suffrage movement had a lot of political acumen. Alternative history is tricky. You never know what could have happened. But perhaps, had the suffrage movement better supported the women seeking equal pay, they could have gotten it through Congress. They could have shepherded it through that committee meeting. But women of the suffrage movement were really focused on achieving the vote. And you can't blame them. It seemed very possible at this time period. And while they, in theory, supported equal pay, they were never opposed to equal pay. They just didn't devote significant resources to it because they had very limited resources, and they said, we need these to obtain the vote. And when we get the vote, you'll get your equal pay. So that's where they really focused themselves. But perhaps, had they supported the equal pay movement, it would have gone through. And conversely, perhaps, had female federal employees felt comfortable enough to support the suffrage movement, maybe that would have had a better chance of succeeding. So one of the lessons, people ask me, what did you learn in writing your books? And one of the lessons that I've learned is this need for solidarity, that solidarity is so important. So I'm going to end with a picture of Annie Rowe. She began to work in the Treasury in June of 1865. She was approximately 19 years old. And in 1917, over 50 years after she began to work there, the Miami Herald Record ran a story of her and other longtime female federal employees, and she was supervising the work of 229 men and women by then. So I wanted to end with Annie because I wanted to say that the experiment of employing women during this period was a success, in that women earned a place on the federal payrolls and never left. But in the late 1860s, the U.S. government missed this crucial early opportunity to elevate female labor. Women's introductions into the federal civil service encouraged private employers to hire women as clerks. So after this period, you start to see more private employers employing women. And they also paid women a lot less. So perhaps had the government set the example of equally valuing male and female labor, that, again, alternative history is hard, but it would have been a really hard thing to retreat from equal pay. And it would have set the standard that male and female labor should be equally respected. Instead, Congress sent a clear message to the nation's employers that women were somehow an exploitable and marginal employee base, and to women that their labor was somehow inferior and not as valuable as male labor. The 59 female Treasury employees who asked in 1866 what makes us to differ from them never got an answer. But the answer was just that they were women. That's it. So thanks for listening to me, and I would love to take your questions. Oh, and there are microphones on either side if you have questions. If you could ask them into the microphone, please.
Hello, Rod Ross,
Hi.
now retired from the National Archives.
Oh.
So this was the same period where African Americans entered the federal workforce. Can you give any comparisons between the ability to get jobs, salary levels, the kind of jobs that were available for African Americans, say, from the end of the Civil War through the 1870s?
So I didn't dig in as granularly to men as I did to women, but there definitely were African-American male laborers. I saw men as, I didn't see in going through any of the records any African American men employed as clerks by the federal government in this period. That doesn't mean they weren't there. I didn't find them. And I will say, in the Federal Register, it didn't always note the race of the individual working. So, for example, I found 3 women who were working as messengers in the Treasury that I only know from cross-referencing census records were African American women. So sometimes they were a little hidden and it was tough to find. But yes, federal employment became an incredibly important job for African Americans, both men and women. In terms of comparison, just because I didn't dig into the data of men as much, but like I said, I know African American women were clerks. I didn't find as many African American men as clerks.
Hi. So you didn't mention Clara Barton.
Yes.
And she always sort of stands out. How was she able to be such a standout, and why didn't you mention her?
Well, I mentioned her in my book.
Okay.
But she didn't make her way in here. And actually, I mentioned her in the context that she worked for the Patent Office.
Right.
Prior to the Patent Office really opening itself up to female employees. So she was brought in the 1850s. And the supervisor that brought her in actually did this radical thing of paying men and women equally at the time. And then he left. He went up to New York, and while he was gone, his boss came and fired all the women and said, this is totally inappropriate to have men and women working in the same office. And her supervisor was really upset about this because he really thought she and her female colleagues were great. And so he was upset, and he came back. And women didn't actually go back on the Federal Register in the Patent Office until 1869, I think. Women did do copy work for the Patent Office, but they didn't physically do it in the Patent Office because the head of the Department of Interior thought it was inappropriate for men and women to be working. And when women did come into the Patent Office, again, they were in a physically separated space. So they were not to be working with men, but in a separate room, segregated. And then Clara Barton also wound up getting into a fight with her female coworkers because for a time before she left the Patent Office, she had made this arrangement with a male coworker who would do her job but give her some of the money for it, and she would use that money to help the soldiers. And her female coworkers said they didn't really know what she was doing with the money, but she's like, why is she getting paid? She's not even here. And Clara Barton came back and said, oh, if they don't want to help the soldiers, that's fine. I'm not going to. So they had a little tiff among themselves. But so yes, she's in the book. I just had to cut things for time.
And other successful women at that time are in the book as well?
So Julia Wilbur is one. I have Jane Swisshelm, who's a newspaper editor. Yes, I mean, varying degrees of success. But again, women were getting hired because they were needy and they were in need of paternalistic help. And so some of those luminaries didn't have that narrative to have a sympathetic story to be hired.
Wasn't there a woman that was the head of the sanitary? Of course, that was during the Civil War. So.
Yeah, some women that worked for the sanitary department, like Mary Sloan, she was in Chicago in the sanitary department and she got hired. You have, her name is escaping me, Josephine Griffin, who worked with Friedman. She worked, and her daughters worked for the federal government, and actually her daughters' salaries supported her later benevolence work. So, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm getting the time's up nod. Oh.
For the Freedmen's Bureau, there were a lot more women who joined the Freedmen's Bureau. How were their salaries, and were they given a lot more independence because they were starting schools and such? And also for our southern neighbors, what was the condition of women's work in the South?
So those are two great questions, and I look forward to writing those 2 next books. But I didn't actually focus that much on this in this book. So I know of some women that worked, like, for example, Josephine Griffin, and Julia Wilbur all did Freedmen's work. But my work was really focused on the federal departments that were in D.C., because a lot of those women were working outside of D.C. Griffin and Wilbur worked in D.C. for a time. And then in terms of the South, I haven't looked at that as much, but I do know that after the Civil War, those women who had been working in the South came up to the federal government here to try to get jobs, which their female coworkers, union ladies, were not happy about. So there was some tension there as well. But thank you all for coming. I appreciate you spending your Tuesday with me, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day in D.C. here. Thank you.